class. We did it. We made it to the end. We're sitting here in week 7, and we're just going to talk about the conclusion of our seminar on public policy problems. You've all picked your own individual public policy problem. But now, this week, really don't want you doing too much other than focusing in on finishing up that final policy paper and making it as good as you can. Keep in mind every step of the public policy process and how you're going to utilize each one and your knowledge of each one to go ahead and make some change. Now that we're in a position to think through the whole policy cycle holistically, I want you to see how it wraps around on itself, right? So you start with media studies and like raising awareness and all this really basic, psychology stuff and agenda setting, and you frame it and you make people disgusted or attracted to it or change people's minds through receive, accept, sample, and framing and priming and these other things you get in box 2. You eventually come around to shaping and crafting legislation or court strategies or regulation or whatever it is you're doing in order to get yourself the actual written policy change in the law, the institutional change you want. That then has to be implemented on the ground by either street-level bureaucrats that might be hired out, private sector or not-for-profit folk, or by state bureaucrats or federal bureaucrats or whomever actually has to implement it on the ground. Once you get your program implemented, you need to evaluate it, which means you need to sit there and think through, all right, what am I measuring? Why am I measuring it? What types of effects should I have? Are these good? Are these bad? Are these what I said we would accomplish at the beginning or not? Is this program actually better or worse at X, Y, and Z than we anticipated? What changes might we make to hit our targets if we're missing them? Or, oh my God, are we exceeding our targets? What changes might we make to exceed them even further? You want to also then think about policy feedback, the politics that those changes are creating, what's happening on the ground with that, because all of that's going to feed into you setting the next agenda to do the next step in your never-ending policy change cycle, right? Because public policy is like the dishes. It doesn't go away. It's not like you hit victory and you walk away and it's done. It's never done. And the second you think it's done, someone's there waiting to tear it all down. Doesn't matter how fundamental you think it is, from the Social Security Act to the Civil Rights Act to the Voting Rights Act, which mostly has been torn down by now, right? Things you thought were settled for 50 years, 100 years can all of a sudden be ripped right back open. The fight doesn't stop. It's just the nature of democracy and a modern, what we call polyarchy, right? Or at least what Robert Dahl called polyarchy. So these policy fights are always going to happen. We will always need advocates. We'll always need people pushing. We'll always need to keep aware of that wheel. We'll always need to periodically get our issue onto the agenda so that issue can be updated. And the agenda's always got to be shifting, and there's always going to be more things vying for the agenda, and the agenda's always going to be limited, and people are always going to come up with new ways to spin and frame, and there's always going to be new people trying to implement things slightly differently. But in the end of the day, maybe technology allows for a little bit of that. A lot of times we're still having the same fights over and over, just slightly askew. Measure what you can, make the changes you can, make your policy convincing, raise awareness as best you can, frame your policy creatively and positively, formulate it the best way you possibly know how, and get it as many resources as you possibly can for implementation. That stage very, very much is often overlooked, and if it's one lesson I could impart on legislators, it would be, look, the great lesson of the last 50 years has been, by not having enough administrative capacity, things that should have been more popular came out less popular than they otherwise would. And you really, really, really might get a lot of bang for your buck if you just invest, 10, 20% more of what you're doing in the implementation stage to make sure it's right and smooth and people really like it. Because I tell you, once in a while I run into a great government program. At the state level, one I just did was Clean Heat RI. I just had these heat pumps, air source mini splits installed in my house. And that was just such a lovely program. It was only open 9 to 4, like Monday to Thursday for questions, but I called them up with questions. Once I got the quote I liked, I put it in. They reserved this dollar amount they're going to give me in an instant rebate. I sent them the pay in full invoice that same day. They approved it all, and they said money will be in my bank account within 5 business days. Super easy, super sweet. Could get people right on the phone. Everything got processed same day. Smooth as hell. Talked to the contractor, talked to me. I was amazed. I was amazed at how well it ran. Same rate, there's another rebate that they run through RI Energy, the electric company, that also is state funded. That, like, it's going to be a 6-month battle and it's going to be miserable. And it's smaller and it's not run nearly as well. So, what is that? Well, 2 different contractors, 2 different efforts put in implementation. One has the governor's name on it, so they're trying to make it look good, and it is running well. The other one has the electric company's name on it, so no one cares about looking good or doing it quickly, and it's running poorly. And people's experience with government, really goes a long way towards their assessment of whether government is actually useful or not, can help or not, and the extent to which it's competent. So if you want to instill competence and confidence in government, the implementation stage is really where to spend your money. And finally, the evaluation stage. Get your measurements right, as accurate as possible. Don't be vague. Don't be fuzzy. I can't stress this enough. Do not be fuzzy. Give me measurements in actual inches and give me fractions of inches. Give me measurements in whatever it is, degrees Fahrenheit, exactly, and fractions thereof. Make sure I can replicate this. Don't just say, well, it's big, kind of like a rectangle. No, give me the angles, give me the length, give me the width. The more you can be specific and you can specify magnitude and velocity and dimension and all of that, the easier it is that I can take something and build it. And that's what we want at that evaluation stage. We want this policy to be replicable. And so the more those variables are specific and measurable and clear and not vague and not fuzzy and not, confusing, the much better it is. Think about it like you're actually trying to build Legos or a deck or I don't care, whatever. The more specific you can be, the far, far better chance anyone has at succeeding in replicating this stuff and seeing whether or not the implementation and evaluation are true. And finally, with feedback, I'll tell you, feedback was a topic of my dissertation. I find the effects really interesting. They can manifest, I think, in confusing and complicated ways. I hope you found that racialized feedback framework idea interesting, that, like, you probably should include race as a variable you measure or evaluate for if you have a program that's implemented across levels of state government and that tends to roll out inequitably. Social Security is a great example of an equitable program, right? Because older Americans tend to be non-Hispanic white at higher rates than younger Americans and tend to have longer lifespans. Social Security beneficiaries are something like, 89% or 90% white, non-Hispanic white, while Social Security payees are somewhere down around 69 to 70% non-Hispanic white. So there's this like 20% gap between who's getting benefits and who's paying in. And that can lead sometimes to people of color being less defensive of Social Security than researchers would otherwise expect, and white folk being more defensive of it than researchers might otherwise expect. So sometimes you got to look at our benefits disproportionately spread, and sometimes you got to look at do they come straight from the federal government, which is usually a pretty fair distribution, or do they get filtered through state and local government where there's just more opportunity for chicanery in one group to kind of capture benefit a little more than another group. You get the right mayor, one side of town's getting a little bit more love than the other side of town. That sort of thing tends to happen the more levels of government you introduce. But finally, that creates a new politics, and that feeds back into who likes or dislikes your policy and who will back you at the next round of policy change or continuation. So, getting all this right, getting every stage right is how you go about solving public policy problems and crafting public policy change in a successful and long-lasting way. And that's what I wanted you to get out of this class. So whatever topic you pick, This is a general framework. You can plug everything from energy policy to health policy to transportation policy. It does not matter into this framework. It works the same way. And I hope that you got that out of it and realize that there is a method to the madness if you do want to create policy change. There's a game plan here. And if you follow it, it does work. But you can't skip any of the steps. There is no shortcut. You just have to go through it all. So that I want to thank you. I want to thank you for listening to me. I want to thank you for the class, and I hope you all have a great little short time off before your next course segment. Bye-bye.